Hello, everyone. Welcome to our CHIWORK weekly conversation. I hope all of you have a great start to your new year. And if possible, please turn on your camera. We'd love to see everyone. And before we start, I would like to thank the other technical program chairs, Max Wilson, Navina, Carosala, Erin Solovi, and Shadaz Sanian, and as well as our student volunteers, Alberta and Isabel and Nabil. And we also thank the National Science Foundation for partially supporting this event. So some logistics, the first 30 minutes of this conversation will be recorded, and there will be mainly a conversation between me and Hanlin. And the second part of this hour will be the open mic discussion, and all of you are welcome to either type any questions or your thoughts into the chat box, or just unmute yourself and speak. And so right now, I would love to introduce our guest for this week, Hanlin Li. So Hanlin is currently a postdoc scholar at UC Berkeley and an incoming assistant professor at the University of Texas, Austin. Her research sits at the intersection of data governance and HCI. She examines the societal and economic impact of data generated by the public, from written data to social media comments. And her research aims to inform policy and design interventions to incentivize responsible data collection and use. She publishes in places like Equisim, Kai, CSCDAP, and FACT. And her work has won awards at those places and has been featured in national and international media, such as New York Times, the MIT Technology Review, and also Bloomberg. And the topic of our conversation today will be on data labor and the labor force behind AI. So let's welcome Hanlin. So thank you for joining me for the conversation today, Hanlin.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction.
The first question I want to ask is, your work looks at the data production as a form of labor, which I find to be really interesting. So for those of us who are not familiar with this concept, can you just tell us a little bit more about why we should view data production as labor and how it relates to other forms of labors that we're probably more familiar with, and why it is important?
Absolutely. The simplest answer to the question of why should we think of data production as labor is that if we think about today's tech industry and data economy, data is producing a lot of value for us, for the economy, and for everyone. But I'm saying this also standing on the shoulder of many giants here, where digital labor, historically, STS scholars have looked at how participating online is a form of digital labor. I'm also looking at how cloud workers are producing data that are very useful for very profitable machine learning models. And thinking of analogies of this, so data labor I'm extending prior work's definition, where it intersects with a lot of the online activities that has historically been seen as labor of love. Example would be like editing Wikipedia, but then the Wikipedia articles are immensely helpful for a lot of large language models and search engines. So this is one of the prominent type of labor of love and data labor. And other activities include, for example, helping your online communities healthy and safe. So help to create, by keeping your online communities safe and healthy, it helps to generate more advertising revenue, because if you imagine if like online communities that are not being moderated, people would not come, and then platforms like Reddit would lose their advertising revenue. So all these type of activities, in a way, either directly or indirectly, they have been generating revenue for companies, and I call all of these type of activities as data labor. So as you can tell, it's a pretty big box, but to think of like why doing this like boundary settings is important, is because I think this year's news cycle, past year's news cycle, has really shown that a lot of the data we are generating are actually being used for a lot of different purposes rather than just providing a service. With DALL-E, GPT-3, and ChatGPT, they are mostly trained on data that's collected, scraped online with people's awareness or consent. So with this type of innovation is moving fast forward. So we really should think about how, as the public, we are actually subsidizing this tech industry by producing data, by contributing our labor of love, by producing content that are very useful as training data.
Yeah, thanks for the great explanations. So yeah, I can see here there's clearly a gap between like how this labor of love or how those volunteer activities like content moderation, like what are the original intents of the users or the workers and how they're currently being used. So I wonder, can you tell us more about what are some existing efforts to address this issue?
Yeah, one of the example I always lean into is I read a paper about Wikidata. It's written by a PhD student at University of Minnesota, Charles. He wrote about how Wikidata contributors are actually don't want their contribution. So Wikidata is like a sister project for those of us who are not familiar with. It's like a sister project to Wikipedia. People contribute data in like a structured format. So they in that paper, they wrote about how contributors or volunteers actually don't want their data to be used for monetization. That being said, I will say it's really difficult for like individual contributors to say, hey, for example, OpenAI, don't use my content, or hey, Google, don't quote my article in your Google search engine result pages. So these are things that I think it's a reality that we all have to grapple with, where we don't have ownership of whatever information we put online. That being said, we have seen like examples for example, Hugging Face is posting processes for people to, for example, opt out of their large models. So that's one way of giving people some more of control or power in terms of how they want their content to be used. But another thing, I think another caveat in this is that this approach, even though, for example, I can individually take away my data from a training data set, that doesn't necessarily damage the model in any way. Also, I'm sure there's another Hanlin in this world who are contributing very similar data to mine. So I want to have that caveat, and I really think this is an important question that we should all think about how to address.
Sure. So when I was reading your work, I think two words really stood out to me. One is power redistribution, and second is revenue sharing. I think both are really looking at this current state of inequality in this problem, right? We have all those large companies, Google, OpenAI you talk about, and then we have individual workers who currently have little power, both in terms of regulating how their data are being used and from really getting a share of the revenue. So from your perspective, I wonder, like, how do you see we can make progress on those two approaches?
Yeah, these are the two actually the biggest problem or challenges I'm facing, just like making incremental steps to address. Like it's really starting with the power distribution. I think this idea started from, for example, how like online communities are somewhat more community driven or democratically governed, where moderators seek community members' feedback, and then together they shape certain like community, like shape some rules or boundary or norms around the online communities. And then all these online community content are like hugely helpful, like they're in common crawl, massive text, and then they're help to training large language models. So this is where I think I'm trying to like think of like, how can we give communities more say in how their data are being used, rather than giving individual consent, hey, do you want your Reddit post to be trained or not? I'm pretty much believing that individual consent process is going to be meaningless because everyone's just going to ignore it or just click accept all the time. So one of the, in the power distribution idea, line of work here, my main goal is to, how can we create a process that creates some sort of stewards or intermediary roles to provide some collective consenting process to help community decide whether they want their content to be used in large models or not. So this is very much like still early thinking on this and doing some very preliminary work on this. But I think this is really one of the important things, because as we see, a lot of people are unhappy about their content and artwork being used in generative AI models. So on the revenue distribution part, this is idea that I've been working around for throughout my PhD. One thing that I think is becoming previously is difficult to put a price tag on data to say like, hey, this data point is going to generate $2 of revenue, and how do we want to distribute it? But as we have seen these years where economists have been really thinking about this issue, including computer scientists who are like trying to assess what's the data point's value to a machine learning model. So I think like as the community grows, we have seen a lot of progress on this. So I'm hopeful that at some point we will have a better answer about what's a fair compensation for data.
Since you're talking about it, I'm curious, can you tell us more about how do you actually price a piece of data in this framework?
Absolutely. Shameless plug here that I did some work on this as well, where I think that there are two ways to price data. The way that I priced it in my recent work is thinking about putting a price tag on the labor hours that people generate data. Example would be content moderators going on Reddit, moderating content. And this labor, like trying to put a price tag on, estimate like what's the worth of these labor volunteer hours that has been helping to shape data, or it's a form of data labor. By doing this, we used the equivalent rate for commercial content moderators, which is the data is very open. Like Upwork, there are a lot of app workers on this freelancing platform to do content moderation per hour. We use this rate to estimate the equivalent value of volunteer labor hours on Reddit, and we got $3 million a year in 2021. So this is one way of like upstream thinking about how can we think of like the labor cost. But then there's also the downstream estimation where it will look like how each data point is going to contributing, like for example, advertising revenue. And has been one of my colleague, Nick Vincent, work on how Wikipedia links or articles are actually contributing to Reddit revenue. So this is another way of estimating this. But then we look at downstream, there are also a lot of other, like other than direct revenue, there's also a lot of other ideas around the market dynamics where data economists have been looking at what are the markets willing to pay for this data point. And this is where of the areas like it has been fast moving. So there's just all of different ways to estimating data. I will say using the downstream, like estimating the downstream value of data has been challenging because there are always going to be like new ways of use data that we cannot predict today. And that just means that new value that data is creating is going to be very challenging for us to like estimate at this day and time.
I wonder if you have any insights on to what degree does the upstream estimation of data value correlate with the downstream data value?
That would be such an interesting question. Yeah, I wish we could have some answers to that. One thing, I'm purely speculating here now. One thing that I do think there are high quality data and there's low quality data. Thinking about like how journalists and writers are publishing like stories that are being used in large language models. These are like a very high quality data compared with, for example, like a Reddit data like comment from me. I'm not gonna like spend that much time and energy in writing a comment on Reddit. So these are like, I think there are definitely like correlations here where high quality data is going to contributing to more revenue, is going to introduce more, like for example, through attracting audiences for the large language model. So that'll be an interesting question to investigate for sure.
Sounds great, yes. And for the power redistribution part, you are talking about how we can engage, instead of engaging with individuals, engage with the community. But I think a challenge there is how we can effectively organize the community, right? Because I think that shares a lot of same challenges with, for example, how can we effectively organize gig workers? Because if you think about traditional labor unions, it's really about those people who share working places, who share working hours. You can just, stand in front of the factory, hand out flyers, and you'll be able to reach out to all of them. But I know for gig workers, it's already challenging because they all work different hours. They don't have the fixed working location. But I imagine it's only going to be even more challenging for example, Redditors or Wikipedia contributors. So what do you think are some challenges or potential ways to address those challenges?
Absolutely. I definitely agree. We have seen this wave of graduate student unionization where it often takes like years of work to see the list of student organizers to like actually have a union vote. But I think in this online context, I'm more a bit optimistic about this because I've seen a lot of discourse, for example, like the Wikidata case where I brought up earlier that volunteers are already like having like getting together and talk about these issues. This has also been in the case for, we also did a survey that was maybe 2019, where we looked at like how people were reacting to like data monetization by social media platforms. The answers we got, there's quite a substantial percentage of people who are like concerned about this issue. And now the matter is, and there's also already people talking about it online or within their communities. So I think it's happening like organically in all these grassroots activities. So I think this is where really like HCI researchers like all of us could think about where, how can we, like we have been supporting human values, community values. How this is just like a new opportunity for us or like a gap for us to address, where how can we help communities to have more say in the downstream uses of their data?
Right, and I think your answer, I really like your answer, and it actually naturally leads to my next question. Because when I look at this problem, one thing that I realize is it's such an interdisciplinary problem with so many aspects that I can tackle this problem from, right? Like you mentioned bottom-up labor activism. You mentioned the top-down policy-making efforts. I think we talked about how can we study the user dynamics and interactions in existing communities like Reddit or Wikidata. But there have also been work on, for example, designing new forms of online communities or collaborative systems that address this issue from the design of this new system. So how do you see all those different aspects can play together to address this problem?
Absolutely, yeah. It's definitely very interdisciplinary challenge. Over the years, I have read about economists, how they like design a data market that is going to be fair and equitable for all the contributors. I've read about computer scientists who are very much thinking about how a data point is going to be worse, how much it's going to worse for like this machine learning model. HCI researchers like us were always thinking about like how can we give people more power, and there's also computational social scientists who are looking at like the market behavior dynamics. So I think like these different fields are contributing to how to do this, like tackling different layers of problems in this like grand scheme of like, oh, we should give people more control over the data, or giving them a share of the compensation. So I think these are just different layers of problems where, for example, market design is just going to, I think we have done a lot of like, I've seen a lot of simulations in data markets. I think this has been like useful for us to think about like in the long term, what type of data markets we want to establish, or do we want to have a data market at all? And in the short term, I think a lot of the HCI opportunities, there are a lot of HCI opportunities to help amplify these grassroots activities and voices that I mentioned earlier. So that's just different stages, or short term, long term. I think that's a better analogy to this. Yeah, and I also want to mention that I think it also definitely requires collaboration with thinking about, I think a lot of the data markets ideas are very much thinking about like what are the benefits for businesses, like what are the best data to get if we have this market. But I think we also need to think about, for example, income equality, where if we were to pay people for their data, very, very likely we know that the people who have the privilege to go online and use all these different platforms are going to contribute much more data than a person, for example, who doesn't have the time and energy to do this. So that's, I think, one of the most important questions we need to think about when we are like developing data markets or thinking of like how to give people compensation for the contribution they produce online.
I see. So among all those exciting directions, which one excites you personally the most?
I'm actually I'm very excited by all of them, I have to say. But I'm actually super interested in about like, well, we have this market design mechanism. How can we apply them into community decision making? Like, can we say have a community council and have communities to like do voting or having vote for elected representatives or sparse sampling, like all these different mechanisms, like how can we adopt them to have like a more community-driven approach to decision-making in data?
I see, yeah, that's super exciting. So another question I want to ask is, I mean, we're seeing a rise of the foundation models in the past few months, ChatGPT, GPT-3, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, all of that. And there have been a lot of discussions on how they may replace many domain-specific models trained with domain-specific data. So that'll be one big model that's replacing hundreds of smaller models. So how do you see this trend might influence data labor?
Yeah, my colleague Nick Vincent, some of you might have heard, saw his work. We had a lot to say about this, like generative AI foundation models and how data is being used in this. To save us some time, I will just mention that we have an Wired op-ed that's going live tomorrow. So I'll definitely share on my Twitter so people can see what do we have to say about this. But one thing I want to caution here is that generative AI models or like foundation models like ChatGPT is going to generate data that is very similar to what a real person creates. So you can say in a way that these models are like producing synthetic data labor. And this raises a good old question about like automation and human labor. We have seen writers and artists being very concerned about how this model is going to like steal their jobs essentially, or cutting down employment opportunities for them. And what's worse here is that these models are all built on their lifelong work without their consent. And so I think all these AI firms should really start thinking or listening to them and thinking about how their model can amplify human labor instead of just pushing out all these creative workers and pushing out what is like and just generating what is essentially a copycat of organic data labor. So I think that's really like an important question for firms and model developers to think about at this point. How can we collaborate with these workers or data producers to really create a model that's useful for them and can help them to build their professional career rather than stealing their career opportunities away?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the point of how the ChatGPT or GPT-3 nowadays can be used as synthetic data labor or synthetic data workers. I think that's a fantastic point. And there was a paper, I think it was at WIS this year, that I really like about how you can basically have GPT models to act as basically synthetic Reddit users or online community users, and you can use that to test basically online community policies. I don't know if I've read that one. I can probably find a link to that somewhere after this talk. But I wonder, do you see this become a challenge to the data vision, the data labor vision you have? Because you can imagine like they can probably be used for a lot of things that currently require human labor to perform. They not necessarily tasks like moderation, but also tasks where data or where human users act as data sources, right? Like I can imagine running maybe a user testing with synthetic users.
Yeah, I think it's definitely creating a challenge, especially for like questions around like what's the value of data labor, because if you couldn't really tell between like organic and synthetic, and then like it's really difficult to tell like, oh, how many hours do people put into this work? In the organic data labor case, we would have some we would love to have some value, but in the synthetic data labor, like the cost is just barely zero. So it's definitely creating some research challenges. I agree on that. But I also think it would be, so here's I think it's going to be still possible to distinguish between synthetic and organic data labor, because there are going to be traces that we can collect and try to estimate. One of the examples would be, for example, I think CNET was using ChatGPT to write news stories earlier this year, and people noticed a lot of errors or like just misinformation or just not fact, just false fact, false estimates in their news stories. So this is just one way of like seeing like, oh, wow, like it's not just gonna be like completely similar to organic data labor, whatever ChatGPT produces. So yeah, I think that's one of the ways to do this. But on the other side, I think this is one of the area where computational researchers or computational social scientists and HCI researchers, economists really have to innovate. And one of my previous work I mentioned earlier about like estimating the labor hours ready moderators put into like working, moderating, volunteering. We really have to like be creative about what data we collect and what metrics we use. And I think this is one of the areas that quantitative researchers could think of, like how can we leverage developing new models to leveraging like whatever is public traces to like estimate the value of data labor or to identify organic data labor.
I see, yes. So I guess the last question on my list was, we've discussed a lot about how we as HCI researchers can approach this problem, can make contribution to this vision. But what are some direct implications of your work for the public? So let's say if an average person, not HCI researchers, wants to take ownership or have a say in how their data labor is used, what can they do right now?
Yeah, that's a great point. For an average person, like just producing content online, I think we have seen some tools that are like coming out that helping people like, have I been trained on this, or how can they opt out from like, for example, Hugging Face's big stack. And so if you want to take control of your work and you want to like sign up for these services and tell the companies to stop using your data for training, that would be great. That's great. And I think one thing that to caution here is that these actions are like, it helps you to take ownership, but if our goal is to, for example, reduce the performance of AI models or making an AI model ineffective, these actions are not going to be super helpful just individually. It would have to be organized, have to be like achieve a substantial percentage according to my colleague Nick Vincent's simulation work. So that means that if we want to have more AI models that are building on data that is collected transparently or collected with community consent, we should really start supporting these other types of models that are out there, Hugging Face, for example. So I think just participating in a lot of all these grassroots activities and conversations will be meaningful to help, for example, let companies see that, like kind of like how consumers boycott, but like how let companies see like what are the community's needs and what are their demands. And this is just one of the approach. The other one, I think, if you are, for example, hosting your own website, and you don't want your website to be crawled by, for example, common crawl, scraped by common crawl, and you can change, for example, the robust text file to tell these crawlers to like don't scrape your content. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying that we should all just go on Wikipedia and delete our edits or all of our blog posts. So I think just instead thinking about how to support these grassroots activities and how to support alternative AI models are going to be helpful to like try to shape the landscape. And another thing I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention is that I'm part of this responsible AI licensing initiative, where we are sending out a call for participation. It's called RAIL initiative. The RAIL initiative is started out as thinking about how can we give developers more control over their AI models. For example, like say that, oh, you cannot use my model for XYZ purposes. But this has been like developing, and we have been having different projects under this initiative where we're thinking about how can we establish data licensing. How can we give data creators and people who build data sets some more of a control, or giving them the power to setting boundaries and norms around how the data should be used. I'll post a link to the chat so people can see. We are very much welcoming participation and feedback. And if anyone has questions, feel free to reach out to me about that later.
Sounds great. Yeah, so we're at the end of our first 30 minutes. So I'd like to thank Hanlin for sharing your insights. And I guess we go end recording right now. And now the second half of this hour will be dedicated to discussion. So for everyone in the audience, please feel free to unmute yourself and just talk about things. I see that we already have some discussion going on in the chat.